Greetings. This is Dr. Joseph Green, head pastor of St. Paul's Missionary Baptist Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. Recently there has been a real stirring up of people that are calling for or supporting the idea of socialism in America. You guys are probably familiar with the term socialism. Socialism is a political economic system of government that actually has oversight, the government or state oversight on the distribution of wealth and resources, and also the means of production. And so you have communism and socialism. Socialism somewhat predates the writing of the Communist Manifesto, which is Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. If you get a chance to look and understand that, communism was a big problem in Europe. And socialism has been something that we've been fighting for many years. So, it's interesting for people to call for socialism. Bernie Sanders is one of the top, presidential candidates. Bernie Sanders is a socialist. You have former President Barack Obama, who was what's known as a Fabian socialist, and I think Bernie Sanders might be that as well. Fabian socialist is someone who believes that you can create a socialistic economic system within a democracy. But I don't think people really understand the pure definition of socialism, because if they did, they would probably change or turn away from their desire to have socialism, take root here in America. The other thing I think is very ironic is when you have a rich person, you have rappers, singers, other people that have accumulated wealth, and now they're calling for socialism. So again, either they don't understand socialism or they're being very naive, because socialism is about the redistribution of wealth, which means, hypothetically speaking, if one person had $1 million, then socialists would come in and say, look, there's 10 other people that don't have $1 million. So what we're going to do is we're going to distribute the wealth from the wealthy, take away from them, and distribute it among the people that don't have any. So it's ironic that someone who has gained a lot of wealth in a capitalistic society like we have in America, while touting for socialism to occur. And my challenge always is to let them start to redistribute their own wealth first, and then we can support their ideas of having the government come in and do it. But, just really ironic that these people are the ones a lot of times that are making the most noise about how great socialism is. Now, we live in a capitalistic society. We live in a free market capitalistic society, and we also, of course, we're not socialistic, or communism is not our governmental system, and that's a good thing, and I'll tell you why. But ultimately, there's several reasons why we should be fearful of this idea of socialism, because when the people actually created or came up with the idea of socialism, or the Communist Manifesto that was written by Marx and Engels, it's like a Trojan horse. It's like false flag. So what they do is they show you one thing, they give you a theme to make people believe that is a good thing, but underneath it is not for the people's best interest. And so if in Europe, which is most of these ideas came from, that helps to shape or the Western society, we live in a the Western culture that we live in was formed. The foundation of it comes from Europe. And so Germany, more specifically, a lot of these ideas originated from, when you think about modern psychiatry, you had Freud and Carl Jung and some of these other psychologists, psychiatrists. So they helped to shape how we look at psychology in America. The economic system that we have here in America was originated in Europe, and so on and so forth. And so when we understand these things originated from Europe, and so what we look at now is kind of the results of it, or the residual of those philosophies. But anyway, when in Europe you had monarchs and fascists and all those type of people that were in rulership, And so they came up with this idea and how to transfer power from these monarchs. And, if you think about a monarch and it's a royalty, so you have a king and a queen, and usually power is just passed on to their children. But they came up with this idea, I'm saying these people that form socialism and communism, that they came up with the idea of how they could seize power, and they did it under the guise of redistributing the wealth or the power among the people or the working class, which is what communism, Lenin, you had Vladimir Lenin, and, you have Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and all these people that helped to form these ideologies. And it was like power to the people. And even if you look at the black, during the civil rights movement, a lot of the symbolism, like the raised fist, actually, it comes from communism and solidarity, the idea of solidarity and unity. So anyway, what they did was they came up with an idea and a strategy to just transfer wealth from these monarchs, these ruling class people. But the only thing that communism and socialism really does is it just transfer power from one group to another group. And so that other group becomes the same as the group that the power came from. When you understand that in socialism and communism, that the ruling class that will stay ruling class, is just maybe a different group of people. And just like if you look at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, you had the czars in Russia that were in charge, so they overthrew them and killed them. But then what came in was the Soviet Union, right? And so the Soviet Union ended up being not only worse, but more deadly than the czars in Russia, because there's this idea that not only does power corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so when you have these forms of government where there's no accountability, the people have no say in who's governing over them. And so ultimately it gives more power and more power to those who are in rulership. And then they become ultimately corrupt. That's how it happens. As opposed to us, and America is not a democracy. We're a representative republic that's ruled by that's governed by the rule of law. We have a constitution, and the constitution is so vitally important. So even when the legislative branch, the Congress, passes new laws, that law has to line up with the overall tone and theme of our Constitution. And so when they pass a law, even if they pass a law in Congress and it's challenged, it can be deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which is, we have our checks and balances in America. And so it's important for us to understand that we live in a representative republic that's governed by the rule of law. And the Constitution is so important for us to understand and for us to lean on, because just like a lot of people will name some of the scourges that happened in America through slavery and Jim Crow and all kinds of oppression, but at the end of the day, it was because of the form of government that we had that allowed that to be corrected. And so we no longer have chattel slavery. We no longer have these segregatory laws that says that no blacks allowed in a restaurant or things like that. And I will say, and I'll say this over and over again, the only perfect governmental system is the system of heaven. And so in the meantime, we believe that this city, this type of government is the best for all of us, for all humanity, until Jesus comes back again. But anyway, so basically, if you have socialism, you have the state that actually is controlling the means of production and resources. And again, it's ironic because if, like for instance, there's this rapper Killer Mike, and Killer Mike, he's a Bernie Sanders supporter, and he also promotes socialism. And so you think about someone like him, and I don't know how much money he has, but chances are he has more money than the average person. He's a popular rapper. And so because of that, think about the irony of what he's suggesting. If it wasn't for a free market capitalistic society, there's a good chance that he wouldn't be wealthy and have any influence. You think about someone like LeBron James. LeBron James came from a single parent family. His mother raised him, and he talks about the challenges that occurred from that. But he goes from just being some kid from Akron, Ohio, to worth nearly $1 billion. You think about Michael Jordan, and you think about these other people. You think about rappers like Lil Wayne and 50 Cent and Jay-Z, and some people have reported that Jay-Z may be worth $1 billion. 50 Cent's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. These people come from meager beginnings, but yet because we live in a free market capital society, they actually use their talents as rappers and become multimillionaires, and so they've able to elevate beyond their situation. I mentioned LeBron James. I mentioned other athletes, that have made a ton of wealth off of their talents, their physical talents. And I believe that they should and they deserve it. But think about this. If they lived in a socialism or a communistic government, their talents wouldn't belong to them. They'd be used for the benefit of the state. They wouldn't be able to profit off of their personal ingenuity, their physical giftings or talents. Somebody else would. And so that's the key difference. I remember back in the 70s and 80s, there was a boxer named Teofilo Stevenson, who was a heavyweight boxer from Cuba, and he won a couple of gold medals in the Olympics. Now, the interesting thing about it is, I think he won either the gold medal 2 or 3 times, and the Olympics is every 4 years, so you figure over a 12-year span, possibly. He was an amateur boxer. At the time, you had amateurs that were in the Olympics competing. So by the time he finished, he was probably 30 years old. And I'm making some assumptions. I do know that he was in a couple of Olympics. I remember watching him box. But, for the sake of the discussion, I'm saying, like say if he was 30 years old when he finished. Now, the difference in him and other people like Muhammad Ali or, Larry Holmes or Joe Frazier or George Foreman, these guys would have been contemporaries with Teofilo Stevenson, but the difference is most of them only boxed in one Olympics because you had amateur athletes back then. Amateurs couldn't make any money. So after they would go to one Olympics and have success or whatever, they would turn pro and begin to profit off of their personal talents, right? Because nobody else should profit off of your talent more than you do. So now, somebody like, George Foreman, and he just stopped boxing a few years ago. So he's made millions and millions of dollars boxing. He was in the Olympics as well. So he went to the Olympics, he fought, and after the Olympics were over, he turned pro and he's made millions of dollars off of his talent. Teofilo Stevenson fought in like 3 Olympics because he came from Cuba, which was a socialistic country, which meant his talents, the only person that benefited from it was the state. So he went out and he boxed and he won gold medals for his country, but he was never able to profit off of it. His country profited off of it. And so people that are touting socialism or communism are looking at a very unrealistic view of the world and how terrible it becomes abusive of people because the state runs everything. The state determines your life. The state determines how your children are raised and where they live. All those things are determined in that governmental system. And so you never have the opportunity to elevate yourself out of that situation because everything belongs to the state. Think about someone if Steve Jobs actually lived in a communistic country. So he invents, the technological advances that he's invented, all the great stuff that he's invented through Microsoft or Macintosh and now Apple. He created all those things and he became a billionaire, multi-billionaire. If he was living in Soviet Russia or communist China, he would have invented that computer and he wouldn't have gotten any extra money because everything he did would have belonged to the state. And so it's important for us to understand how wicked that is because, even the Bible says a workman is worthy of his hire. And these things that we're talking about, it doesn't stimulate people for excellence. What I mean by that, it doesn't stimulate people for excellence. Because of the fact that if everybody gets the same thing, because socialism basically is promoting equal outcomes, everybody ends up at the same place. So if everybody ends up at the same place, whether you put a lot of effort or not a lot of effort, nobody's going to try hard. Nobody's going to do any better or any more than they have to because what is the point? There was a college instructor, and he wanted to teach his children about socialism and how dangerous it was. So what he started telling them is he was going to give them tests, and everybody was going to get the same grades on the test, no matter what you did. So now, always in a classroom setting, you'll have about 3 or 4 different groups of people. So you'll have the A+ students who do all their work, they put forth the effort, and they get 100 or get an A on their exam. Then you have the BC students who put in just enough effort to to pass, or sometimes maybe they're just not as bright as the A plus student. So you have the A's, then you have the B and C's, and then you have the D students or the F students. And so the F students, they either don't understand the material, they're not bright enough to catch on and to do well on the test, or they just are lazy and don't want to put forth the effort. You have the other people that are really just challenged and they're trying but they can't succeed. So now, if you have an exam and a course and there's equal outcomes, everybody gets the same thing, then what happened in this classroom is it never encouraged the B and C and D students to push harder. It encouraged the A students to do less work. Because if you're going to get the same anyway, and that's what happens in socialism and communism, people aren't going to exude excellence. They're not going to try their hardest. They're not going to try to elevate themselves beyond their lot in life, because they're going to believe, that it doesn't matter. You're not going to get anything different. You're not going to get any more, and so those are the dangers of socialism. Also, socialism doesn't create wealth for the common people, because the biggest enemy in socialism and communism is the middle class. And so you will always have less of a middle class. You always have more poor people, but you'll always have that ruling class on top that never seems to fail. Now, again, that empowers the government even more so, because at least in America, even though a lot of our politicians are abusing their power or ignoring things, but they still are in a position where they have to attempt to appease their constituents. And you have checks and balance. So even in Congress, if they do something that's out of a line or out of pocket, if they pass a law, the president has the power to veto it, right? And then they can override the president's veto by 2/3 majority vote. But you do have pushback. You do have remedy for things that you believe is detrimental to those who are your constituents. But anyway, let's dig down into this a little bit deeper. When we put so much power in the hands of a few, which is what socialism and communism ultimately will do, there's no upward or downward mobility, or upward mobility, I should say. And so whatever lot in life that whatever hand you draw in life, that's where you stay in socialism. Many years ago, I was in Russia, and when I was in Russia, in the United States Navy, it was soon after the Cold War had ended and the wall had come down, and Russia was very poor. One of the reasons why Russia had to tear the wall down, between East and West Germany, was because the people started to starve. When you look at Venezuela is a very oil-rich country, but they also are a socialistic country, and because of the red tape and the bureaucracy, they basically, the people are starving. They're having riots. The economy is collapsing because socialism doesn't work, and long term it oppresses the masses instead of empowering them. So if you put all this power in the hands of a few people without any remedy of their going against the will of the people or what's best for the people, and there's no checks and balances, you will have ultimate corruption. Now, in the 20th century, there's a term called democide that was created, and democide is death by government. And it's a term proposed by R.J. Rummel since at least 1994, who defined it as the intentional killing of an unarmed or disarmed person by government agents acting in their authoritative capacity in pursuit to government policy or high command. According to him, this definition covers a wide range of deaths, including forced labor in concentration camps, victims killing by unofficial private groups, extrajudicial summary killings, and mass deaths due to the government acts of criminal omission and neglect, such as in debate families as well. Such as deliberate famines, as well as killings by de facto governments, i.e. civil killings. This definition covers any murder by any number of persons by any government. Rummel created the term as an extended concept to include forms of government murder not covered by the term genocide. According to Rummel, democide surpassed war as the leading cause of non-natural death in the 20th century. Some examples of democide cited by Rummel include the Great Purges carried out by Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, the deaths from a colonial policy in the Congo Free State, and Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, which resulted in a famine that killed millions of people. Rummel reclassified Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward as democide in 2005. He originally believed that Mao's policies were largely responsible for the famine, but Mao's advisors had misled him. But let's look at some numbers here. The unknown story alleged that Mao knew of the famine from the beginning, but did not care. And Mao Zedong, of course, is from China, but did not care. And eventually Mao had to be stopped by a meeting of 7,000 top Communist Party members. Based on this new evidence, Rummel now believes the famine was intentional and considers it democide. Taking this into account, the total for Chinese Communist Party democide is 80.86 million. So the Communist Chinese Party killed 80.86 million Chinese. In the Soviet Union, 62 million people were killed by socialist Soviet Union. Nazi Germany, which was socialist, it's the National Socialist German Party, they killed 21 million in other regimes of the 20th century. So you have to understand that this is the ultimate end of socialism, where you have these mass murders, because what happens is, as I stated, you had these monarchies, you had these totalitarian governments in Europe, and they would have revolutions that went in and overthrew the leaders, and most of them was sparked by these communist, the communist revolutions that occurred to seize power, but the only difference is they just replaced that power with their own power, and so it actually got worse instead of getting better. And so you have to understand that that's the ultimate goal of communism, is to control the masses, and so they put things in place in order to do so. Now, the Bible talks about that. It talks about the fact that one of the ways that the enemy keeps people in emotional bondage is through promising them to take care of their needs. Even in Revelation 13, it talks about taking the mark of the beast, and no one can buy or sell unless they take the mark. In the book of Second Thessalonians, it talks about when they yell peace and safety, sudden destruction is upon them, and they will not escape. Right? It's talking about this governmental system that will promise to take care of the needs of the people. The people will ultimately give over their power to this governmental system, and then they will find themselves in spiritual and emotional bondage. And so it ends up being worse than anything else that can occur. So anyway, let's look at how that manifested, because this was the strategy of the globalists in the beginning, that they came up with these governmental systems in order to, as they stated, as I stated, there was revolutions. There were very bloody coups that occurred in Europe and many different places, in China as well. So they decided that wasn't the best strategy. So they came up with strategies in order to get bloodless coups, or revolution without bloodshed, as they said. So how did they get the people to surrender their power to the power of these ruling class people? If you've been listening to the 2019 movement and some of my other videos and some of my other podcasts, I talked about what's called hegemony and cultural hegemony. Now, why is that important? So hegemony is this idea or the belief that there will always have a class of people that rule over the masses. There will always be people that rise to the top and rule over other people. That's what hegemony is. Now, cultural hegemony is a thing that was created by Antonio Gramsci, who was in Italy when, during the fascist regime in Europe in the 20th century, and he wrote this thing called Prison Notebooks. And so he was jotting down some of his thoughts and how you could seize power from one class for the other class. It's called cultural hegemony. And basically what cultural hegemony is you create a culture by weakening the family structure, by attacking gender roles, by attacking some of the basic principles and pillars of society. You attack them in a way that reestablishes them in a different way, which ultimately not only weakens the family, but weakens individuals. And so the people will willingly surrender their control to the state or to the governmental people. And so that's what you see happening in America very slowly but surely. It's like the frog in the pot syndrome. The temperature's up and the frog is boiling, but many people are asleep at the wheel because of cultural hegemony. Has really, one of the things they do is dumb down the masses and desensitize people. And so as long as people are promised to have a certain level of comfort, they don't fight against these, the big picture thing. When you start to share truth to people, a lot of them, they get kind of funny acting. They don't want to hear it because ultimately, as long as they're comfortable, then they're okay with their with being in bondage, right? When they yell peace and safety, sudden destruction is upon them. And so I need you to understand that what is happening. But let me move forward a little bit in this and how cultural hegemony has been so prevalent in this whole idea of socialism or taking care of the needs of the people as a way to oppress them. And how it's happened. So, most of you are familiar with the fact that 2019 was the 400-year anniversary of the first slaves coming to America from Africa, right? And the British colonies of Virginia. So, for about 250 years, you had what was known as chattel slavery, where African people of African descent and their children were actually property. They were enslaved. They weren't free, right? So then you have the Emancipation Proclamation in the 1860s, which freed the slaves and made slavery, involuntary servitude became illegal, but unless you committed a crime. That's what the 13th Amendment said. So afterwards, they would, in the South many times, they had these racist policies where they would lock black males up and put them in the chain gang to help them to rebuild the South, which started the prison industrial complex, which we know even to today, the prison system is very lucrative and profitable for many people. So it's another type of form of slavery in America in many aspects. So you had that, but then after, slavery, you had Jim Crow, segregatory laws, the civil rights movement in the 60s, which actually gave legal protection against racism. Because what you have to understand now a lot of people get it confused, and I'll say this, and I'll make this point short, that you have to separate or differentiate between racism, bias, and prejudice. So racism is institutional and it's systematic. So slavery was racism because when they enslaved people based on the race, the black race, that's systematic and institutional, and it was under the protection of the laws of the land. Then you had Jim Crow in the South and segregatory laws, that was institutional, was systematic. So, for instance, if I was black and I went in a certain place in the South and they said no blacks allowed, if I went into a restaurant or a public place or go into a bathroom, they could call the police and the police would come and arrest me for breaking the law. So that's systematic and that's institutional. Now, you can't necessarily use laws to get away from bias or prejudice, and everybody has bias or prejudice, but that's different than racism. But anyway, I need to make that point because what happened in the 1960s, there was laws that were put into effect, the civil rights laws, and you had affirmative action and different things that came after that actually helped to correct the systematic and institutional racism that occurred in America. And so the powers that be lost the physical ability to enslave the people, especially people of color, but using cultural hegemony, they created a culture in which it could enslave the people emotionally and spiritually. If you look in the book of Deuteronomy, when Israel was coming out of Egypt, they no longer were physically in bondage, but they were in emotional and spiritual bondage, which is why one of the things they said to Moses was, Moses, why did you bring us out of Egypt? We remember when we're going to starve to death out here, what they said. They said, we remember when we were in Egypt, at least we got to eat the fish and the lentils for free. And so in their mind, they were still emotionally and spiritually in bondage because they preferred the food of slavery over the freedom that they were able to have, once they were free, once God freed them. So now in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, you had people becoming free. Civil rights went away, it cast down the institutional, systematic racism in America. But then they came up with a couple of things to try to keep black people and the lower class people in emotional and spiritual bondage. It was called the War on Poverty, which was a form of socialism. LBJ came up with this thing called the Great Society, and the Great Society was literally a socialistic program under the guise of looking out for the people's physical needs. It actually did what cultural hegemony does, is it weakened the family structure, weakened individuals, and created governmental dependency. That's what they were doing. That's what they were shooting for. So, and it wasn't a secret, because LBJ stated that the reason he started to support the civil rights movement, because he knew what he was going to put into place, and he knew that it would gain political power for the Democrats by the black people voting Democrat. He says we're going to have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Now, how did he know that? He knew that because he used cultural hegemony. I'm not saying he was an expert and he knew what cultural hegemony was, but someone had advised him and gave him the plan and how to get governmental dependency by these people, black people in particular. And so let's read. Now, Patrick Moynihan was an advisor during LBJ, and when they created this, what they call the War on Poverty or the Great Society, which was socialism, he acknowledged that this would weaken the family in the black community. And I'm going to read some of this. Here's the report that Patrick Moynihan came up with. This was back in the 60s. In the introduction to his report, Moynihan said, "The gap between the Negro and most other groups in America's society is widening." He also said that the collapse of the nuclear family in the black lower class would preserve the gap between possibilities for Negroes and other groups and favor other ethnic groups. He acknowledged the continued existence of racism and discrimination within society, despite the victories that blacks had won by civil rights legislation. Moynihan concluded the steady expansion of welfare programs can be taken as a measure of the steady disintegration of the Negro family structure over the past generation in the United States. Now, you got to realize that the black family, has been weaker for the last 50 years than it was for the preceding 350 years. So during slavery and Jim Crow, there was a lot of things that happened, but we had a stronger family structure. And in the 1960s, you only had a 22% out of wedlock births to black people, 22% out of wedlock births in the 1960s. Now, this is coming through slavery and Jim Crow and racism in America. We only had 22% out of wedlock births. So when we look at the black family now, which is over 70 to 75% out of wedlock births, the family structure is weakened. That's because of cultural hegemony. And you have to realize that it can't be because of slavery, because our family structure was stronger up until the civil rights era, where now laws are in place where they can't discriminate against you by your race, right? Can't do it publicly and legally. And so I want you to understand that this is not a coincidence. This is something that was intentional. It's motivated. You know, in America, we look at now the weakened family structure of black people, which has caused what? Governmental dependency, a weakened culture, and weaker people that are dependent on the government more than dependent on themselves and their own community. I'm not saying it's only black people, but we're focusing on it because black people have been hit the hardest, and the study done by Patrick Moynihan understood that that's what was going to happen. This was 50 years ago when they said that. Moynihan concluded the steady expansion of welfare programs can be taken as a measure of the steady disintegration of the Negro family structure over the past generations. More than 30 years later, this was in 1998, S. Craig Watkins described Moynihan's conclusions representing hip-hop culture and the production of black cinema. The report concluded that the structure of family life in the black community constituted a tangle of pathology capable of perpetrating itself without assistance from the entire white world, and that at the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of the Negro society is the deterioration of the Negro family. It is the fundamental source of the weakness of the Negro community at the present time. Also, the report argued that the matriarchal structure of black culture weakened the ability of black men to function as authority figures. That particular notion of black familial life has become a widespread, if not dominant, paradigm for comprehending the social and economic disintegration of late 20th century black urban life. The Moynihan Report generated considerable controversy and has long-lasting important influence. Writing to Lyndon Johnson, Moynihan argued that without access to jobs and that the means to contribute meaningful support to a family, black men would become systematically alienated from their roles as husbands and fathers, which would cause rates of divorce, child abandonment, and out-of-wedlock births to skyrocket in the black community. And this was in the 1960s he wrote this, leading to vast increases in the numbers of households headed by females and the higher rates of poverty, lower educational outcomes, and inflated rates of child abuse that are allegedly associated with these factors. Now, so I need you to understand this is ultimately what socialism does to communities. It weakens the family structure, causes governmental dependency, and that was the ultimate goal of socialism. The people that created socialism was not trying to help the masses, they were trying to control the masses. And so when you understand that, and understand it especially has affected the black community harder than any other community, we should have our eyes open and understand that this is not a good trend and we need to break this cycle while we can. But we thank you anyway. This has been another episode of Decoding Mystery Babylon, and I pray that you have ears to hear what I'm saying, so that we can, as the Bible says, be mindful of the devices of the enemy, so that he does not gain the advantage over us. Until next time, peace and blessings. This is Dr. Joe Green, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.